Okay, next I will talk about the making of the cant frames at the bow and stern of the ship. Regarding the cant frames, they range from X1 to X8, and also from Y1 to Y8. X1 to X8 represent the cant frames at the bow. X1 is the one further aft, while X8 is the one closer to the bow, which is the front end. So, from front to back, it goes X8 to X1. For the stern, from back to front, it goes Y8 to Y1. This is the sequence. The cant frames can be categorized into those with variations on top and those with not. I will explain each of these separately. Currently, I am using Y7 for demonstration. Y7 is this one, and it does not have top variations. Then, there is another one, Y8, which is a bit special. Y8 doesn't have the upper part. During the process, you may notice the absence of that component, just know it's normal. Now, let's proceed with the assembly. The assembly method for the cant frames is the same as that for the straight frames. Follow the previous method to assemble it, comparing it with the drawing pattern below. This is one piece, and the other one is the same. Remember to sand off the carbon black at the connection point. We'll skip the assembly part. After I finish assembling, we'll continue with the explanation. Alright, currently, all 4 frames have been assembled, and I've also removed the protrusions on top and done some simple sanding. You can follow my example and label them with numbers, as it will be helpful during installation to avoid confusion. Regarding the cant frames, the making process is not significantly different from that of the straight frames. The overall process is the same, but it's crucial to pay attention to the orientation. The orientation of cant frames is more prone to confusion than straight frames, so be sure to pay close attention to it. Before installation, carefully consider the direction of the steps. This is essential. Next, I'll take these 2 to demonstrate the situation. These 2 are the pair on the right side of the hull, right side pair of Y7. We can see the sanding lines here. During the making of these 2, there are 3 situations for cant frames. In the first case, they are closed like this, connected together. There is only one pair of frames on the drawing. This is the first situation. The second situation is when they are separated, like 2 independent pieces. In this case, avoid sticking them together during sanding. It's incorrect. This set is Y2, let me show you Y2. Y2 looks like this, and the sanding lines for this set are on the outer side. Specifically, when fixing them onto the keel, you need to do some simple sanding to the mating surface based on the situation. Here, there will also be an illustrative line, as well as a small sanding line here, as it is positioned very closely to the edge, making it difficult to see the sanding line clearly. Alright, besides the case of Y2 as well the case of Y7, there's also the situation with top variation frames. I will provide a separate explanation for the situation with top variations shortly. In the process of making this section, start by gluing the lower part together. After gluing the lower part, you can place some spacers on top to ensure the correct spacing, and then proceed with an overall sanding. Here, sand directly from this point to the other side, reaching the edge of this frame. It's done in this manner. The same applies to the inner side, sanding from here as well. In some cases, like the earlier situation with Y2, where there are no inner sanding lines, in such a case, if you want to pre-sand, you need to follow the lines on the drawings and draw them onto the frame for pre-sanding. However, you can also choose to glue them on directly. After assembling the ship, you can then sand it. For this frame, it indeed has no way to laser draw inner sanding lines, as both sides face this direction, making it impossible to draw inner sanding lines. Now, moving on, we will proceed to glue and sand these for Y7 frames. Alright, so now these 2 frames have been sanded, and they look basically like this. You can take a look. Overall, it's not too difficult, and sanding it is similar to the straight frames, without significant differences. Here, there is a sloping surface at the bottom, and when it comes to the keel, it should look like this, adhering in this way to the keel. Here, there is a counterslope. When you sand it, you'll notice a counterslope. However, this counterslope is quite normal. Once you actually place it on the ship, you'll get an idea of the situation. So, there's no need to worry too much about it. Now, at the bottom here, after you attach it to the ship, you may find that it rises slightly, creating a triangular area where the pointed corner is slightly elevated. This occurs for various reasons, and after considering many situations, we have found it to be the most ideal solution. In this case, after the overall assembly, you just need to sand the corner off and then it will be fine. Next, let's talk about cant frames with top variations. By the way, for cant frames with only a single frame, I won't go into detail separately. Because for single cant frames, they are essentially the same as those with two frames in a pair, with the only difference being that the sanding line, taking Y2 as an example, you should sand it up to the edge of this frame, not both frames. Because for a single frame, it generally does not involve sanding both frames together. So you must pay attention that the sanding line is only for this frame, not both frames together. Now, let's move on to cant frames with top variations. Okay, let's continue with the cant frames with top variations. There are a total of 3 such cant frames, X3, Y1, and Y5. There's a slight difference between the top variation frames at the bow and stern of the ship, and I'll explain them separately. First, let's talk about the one at the bow, which is X3. X3 is an frame with top variations, and the part that differs from normal cant frames is a 4 mm piece. The same applies to the subsequent Y1 and Y5, both having a 4 mm piece. For this irregular frame, they also get 2 frames in a pair, and the one at the back, right here, is actually no different from the normal frames. It follows the same making method as regular cant frames. I've already prepared this one in advance, so I won't go over it again. Our main focus is on the irregular one. There are 2 ways to approach the irregular frame. One shortcut method involves simply pasting the 4 mm part onto the 2.5 mm part underneath, as shown here. It's a lazier method and doesn't achieve a perfect representation. Now, let me explain a more authentic method which has 2 variations. The more authentic methods involve shaping the thick part, as the previous method did not include shaping. In terms of gluing, the steps are the same as the previous method, following the lines on the drawings for gluing. This step is no different from the previous method. After gluing, we need to trim this area, similar to what we did before for the other frames that got top variations. However, this one has a larger span. Also, please note that the upper part should be trimmed to the same width as the lower part, which is 2.5 mm. However, for this particular frame, you need to trim it to a width of 3.5 mm, removing only 0.5 mm. By the way here, after trimming, create a curved shape, and sand down the inside by 0.5 mm, and then that's about it. Alright, so after sanding, it looks like this, and it's essentially finished. Then, at the bottom, you can create a relatively long curve from here, and on the inner side, remove an arc as well. Next, we glue it. If you need to place a spacer underneath, you can use a 0.5 mm spacer. If you want to place spacers on top, you can use 2 1 mm spacers. Ensure that the part is sanded down to 3.5 mm at the top. It's relatively simple. There's another method that is a bit more complex but provides a more authentic look. In this method, since the upper part is 4 mm, you first sand it down to 3.5 mm. After reaching 3.5 mm, during installation, you add a 0.5 mm spacer underneath. So, during installation, you place a 0.5 mm spacer at the bottom, raising it by 0.5 mm. This way, there's a staggered effect. In this situation, you can then sand the upper part down to 3 mm. In this case, it can still align with the gun port. This method allows for a bit more authenticity because from the previous method the lower part is 2.5 mm, and the upper part is 3.5 mm. It might appear slightly thicker at the top, but it's reasonable though, and sometimes, in the original drawing, such situations might occur. But if you prefer a slightly thinner look, it might be more harmonious. However, if you're not concerned about showcasing the upper part of the frame, there's no strict requirement, and even shortcut methods, like the one mentioned earlier, could be suitable. Now, the X3 is glued, and the gluing process is similar to that of the middle straight frames and other cant frames. The form is like this, and for sanding, follow the previous methods, conducting both inner and outer sanding. There are sanding lines on both sides. Alright, let's now talk about the cant frames at the stern. There are Y1 and Y5, and I'll take Y5 as an example. Y1 and Y5 are quite similar, with the only difference being the spacing in the middle. Y1 has a 1 mm spacing due to 2 thickness reductions, while Y5 has a 0.5 mm spacing due to a single thickness reduction. So, their production is quite similar. Before starting the assemble, we still need to first identify the 4 mm part. The other frame has already been prepared and I won't go into much detail. Before gluing, we need to sand this part appropriately. How much to sand? You need to remove approximately 0.3 to 0.4, but not too much. Ideally, it should be 0.5. However, if you sand 0.5, it might be a bit loose when fitted. Now, let me show you the lazier production method. It's similar, but we've sanded about 0.4. After fitting it on the ship, if it's too tight, you can sand it a bit more. On the top, you may choose not to stick the spacer block in the middle and just bond one spacer block here. This way, it will fit more snugly onto the platform. Now, let's discuss a method that is not as lazy. The non-lazy method is quite similar, thinning it out by sanding around 0.4. Then, you can follow the same method as the X3 we made earlier. After completing this, I'll show you the final result. So, with this, the cant frames at the stern are finished. It's similar to the front ones, but without the need for elevation. You can achieve a harmonious look without elevating it. Well, in fact, you can also choose not to elevate for the front ones. For this one, since the upper part is only a bit more than 3 mm, and the lower part is 2.5 mm, the thickness looks normal. A simple transition suffices, and then we proceed to the final sanding. Next, we'll sand all the cant frames, and then we can start making the hawse pieces at the bow.